This is the Dirty Lou Podcast. This week's guest, Michelle Souliere, author of Bigfoot in Maine. So this is Duke from the Dirty Lou Podcast, and I'm here today with Michelle Souliere, who is the author of this book, Bigfoot in Maine. Really cool cover art. Did you draw that also?
Yep, that's my artwork. Yep.
That's awesome. That's very cool. The book is full of pictures you've taken of locations you've been to, some like artistic representations of different stories you have featured. And that's been a little nice thing about this book going through, is enjoying that stuff. Bigfoot in Maine. So I'll be the first to admit that I've been a really big Bigfoot fan since the movie Harry and the Hendersons. I think for a lot of people who are like my age, we watched that when we were kids and we were just like, what? Like Bigfoot? And then, you stumble across a show on TV. Maybe you watch, what was that show by Leonard Nimoy? He narrated.
In Search of?
In Search of. That's another early memory I have, was an excellent episode of Bigfoot on In Search of. And so for me personally,
instead of it sitting on the shelf right there.
That's awesome. That's pretty awesome.
Episode.
Yeah, I think it's considered like the Bigfoot episode of In Search of is considered one of its like premiere episodes, I believe. So for me, that's kind of where it all started. I'm a sucker for like Bigfoot shows. I have been to the Cryptozoology Museum in Portland. I've met Lauren Coleman. He signed a book for me.
A lot of people do.
It's really awesome. And I forced my wife and my kids to sort of deal with it. And now they know a lot about Bigfoot too. And I stumbled across a Facebook page about Bigfoot. I joined a couple months ago. I've been a lurker, reading some stories and stuff. And then I saw a post one morning about your book, Bigfoot in Maine. And me personally, I don't think I've ever actually seen a book or any sort of Bigfoot media specifically dedicated to Maine. Even the Cryptozoology Museum isn't specifically Maine. So I think for me, that's really what got me to be like, oh, what is this? And don't get me wrong, I've read a couple stories online. I've seen some YouTube videos, but to have a collection of, prominent sightings here in Maine is a really cool thing. So it really inspired me to reach out to you and kind of see what this is all about. And I've read, a good portion of the book and I love it so far. And I love reading about places I'm familiar with. I love reading people's names that are the names of, typical names in our area. I mean, I'm from Lewiston, so French names, just reading that stuff in a historic sense, all around Bigfoot. I mean, for me, just really awesome. And the book's been great. And I'm excited to chat with you about some of the sightings. I'm excited to hear about your inspiration behind the book and what it was like writing it. And I think I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you could just kind of tell us, Michelle, a little bit about who you are, your background, etc.
Sure. I'm, primarily like a book and art and monster type person. Those are my general interests. I started the Strange Maine blog back in 2005 on a whim, and that just kind of kept going and turned into the research that has now turned into 2 books. And there's like several more I would like to write that I kind of have like this little list of stuff that's on the back burner. So that's my background is books and writing and illustration and an interest in the weird in general.
Now, let me ask you this. You said it was the Strange Maine magazine or blog?
Strange Maine blog, yeah.
Now, you wrote 2 Bigfoot books so far?
No, I wrote Strange Maine, True Tales from the Pine Tree State, which is kind of like a Whitman sampler of weird Maine current and past events and personalities and places.
Sounds cool.
So kind of a catch-all for some stuff that I had written short articles about on the blog, and then I did more extensive research and created more original material about those topics, and then made them into chapters in the book. And one of the chapters was about Bigfoot in Maine. That was part of one of the chapters, and Lauren Coleman actually came to me and said, do you want to co-write a book about Bigfoot in Maine? And I said, well, yeah, okay. So that's how all this started. Eventually he had to lay it aside because he had so many other obligations. So I kind of had to scramble and figure out what I wanted to do for the other half of the book that I previously didn't have to write.
Now,
And
if people don't know, Lauren Coleman is like one of those guys you see on Bigfoot shows who's like a Bigfoot expert, right? Like you're watching some show on like the History Channel, and they're like, and now we go to Bigfoot expert Lauren Coleman. And
yeah,
this like, friendly looking guy with white hair and a white beard kind of gives us a quick rundown on the situation. He's
yeah,
he's kind of a bigwig in the Bigfoot field.
he is. Yeah. Yeah. He's still enthusiastic about it after all these years. He's as interested in it today as he was, decades ago when he started. So and I feel like that's one of those fields that it's great for that. Has an enduring interest. Like just when you think you know it all, you run across stuff where you're like, wait, what?
I think like the rabbit hole for Bigfoot topics and like, all the stuff with Bigfoot is a deep rabbit hole. I know I've been down it many times myself.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool. Lauren Coleman, of course, is he was from the Cryptozoology Museum. And if you have never been there, it's right in town Portland. And I believe there's like at least an 8-foot tall Bigfoot like statue in there, right? The thing's massive, if I remember right.
The Crookston Bigfoot. Yeah. That used to be in the front of my bookshop when we shared space.
Oh, you shared space there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, that sounds familiar now. Yes, the bookshop was kind of on the street side, and the entrance to the Cryptozoology Museum was on the other side, right?
Yeah, he started out he sublet my back room from me because there's a second room behind the shop. Mm-hmm. And for a while, the museum was there, but it was very small. So when an opportunity to move further back into the building and have his own entrance popped up, he grabbed that.
Yeah.
And that's where he was before he moved out to his current location on Thompson's Point, which is continuing to expand.
Oh, so I haven't been to the new location then.
Yep. You should
go.
Right.
Noted. Noted. I will.
They just doubled their size over there. So
what would you say, like, what was your first paranormal or weird kind of thing you remember like getting into that kind of put you down the path?
Well, when I was a kid, I was a voracious reader. And there was a whole section in the library branch that I used to go to with my family that was the nonfiction kids section. And they had a pretty good population of books about like Loch Ness monsters, UFOs, stuff like that. And I don't know if they had like put up a display or something, but at some point I latched onto that and basically read everything in it. And then from then on, I was always interested in that kind of stuff. I got a little distracted, during the teen and early 20 years, but it was always kind of in the background.
Yeah.
And then as I got a little older and didn't have, a lot of schoolwork or other stuff to do, I started looking into it on my own, and actually read Lauren Coleman's Mysterious America, which one of the things that inspired me to start the Strange Maine blog. So that kind of kicked off my curiosity about it, not just like as a broad topic, but as a local topic, because I looked around and I was like, there were no websites which just talked about weird Maine stuff. And I knew there was a lot of it. So I was like, and then I pressed that little button that says start a blog. that was the start of it all. So, it was an early start I was probably, I would guess somewhere between 8 and 10 years old when I started reading about stuff like that.
Now, where are you from?
Well, I've been in Portland since kindergarten.
Okay.
Before that, we kind of bounced around a little bit. Um, I wasn't born in Maine, so I'll never be a Mainer officially, even though my dad's from here. So I was born way down in DC, and then we moved back up here because they decided they didn't want to raise kids where there was smog. Um,
Yeah.
so
And no
smog over
billboards
the
either.
Beltway. Yeah, no billboards either. So we came back up here and lived in a couple of smaller towns before we went up in Portland when I was in kindergarten. So
I mean, I would say, you're a Mainer. If there's any doubt in your mind, I think you've earned it.
I have a great love of Maine.
Yeah.
But I would not tangle with like multi-generational Mainers because they will just every time be like, no.
Yeah, right. You don't go back that far.
I pick my battles.
No, that is really awesome. I do think you're a Mainer. Um, assume you read a lot of Stephen King.
Actually, that's kind of funny. I do now, but when I was younger, the first Stephen King book I picked up was Salem's Lot.
Yeah.
And I got as far as like in the first chapter or two, there's a scene that takes place in an attic. Those of you who've read the book will know that part. And I read that and I was like, nope. Put it down. Never went back. I think I was probably, gosh, must have been my early teenage years at that point, maybe 13. And I did not pick it up again until I was in my early 30s. And even then I found that I wanted to always read it in the morning when the sun was coming up, as opposed to in the evening when the sun was going down. It was a little too real. So I have a very active imagination. So, but I'm a huge horror fan now. But when I was younger, my imagination prohibited me from engaging with horror too much because the dark hours are long and lonely.
Especially being from Maine, like we can visualize the small towns he describes. We recognize the names of the people. We understand the references that Stephen King makes. We can hear the voices of his characters in our heads because we're Mainers and we understand. So it really does make it much more real. I mean, I feel like we just live in sort of Stephen King's world, and sometimes we go along for the ride, being in Maine. That's very interesting. So, I mean, you don't necessarily love to be scared. You just enjoy the unknown and kind of strange things. And
I do. I also enjoy being scared now, but
all right.
that came with age, a little perspective.
Do you find Bigfoot to be scary?
That's a good question. I know I've talked to a lot of people who have had encounters that terrified them. I've often wondered what it would be like to encounter Bigfoot myself. I would like to think it would go better than that. But I think more than any sort of fear of Bigfoot, I like to think that I have a very healthy respect for any of the large mammals in Maine's woods. That's one of the things that starting to do kind of field trips and going to locations and bushwhacking and doing all that stuff taught me, because I went with one of my friends who's a Maine guide, and he kind of did his best to teach me what he could of woodsmanship and the things I needed to know and the things I needed to look out for and the things I needed to be prepared for in case they ever happened. Carrying bear spray, learning how to navigate with a compass, so much, basically enough for me to know that I know nothing. I know a little tiny bit of what most people have years of experience doing. So I have a tremendously healthy respect for all the large mammals in Maine's woods. I think that would be my bigger focus rather than fear. I think, fear generates more fear, and I kind of try to steer away from that.
So you've gone out and you've been on expeditions or like missions to find Bigfoot, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How did it go?
It was really interesting. It was very informative because I realized that anything could be hiding from you right next to you practically in most of the Maine's overgrown areas. And you would never know. Uh, there were deer that were right next to us at various points, and we didn't realize until we went back through that area and they had left trace when we didn't see any before.
Oh.
And the undergrowth creates so many layers of screen that to be able to see a large object can be almost impossible because there's so much breakup of the outline just naturally by the environment itself.
Yeah.
Even when there aren't leaves on the trees, even when it's the dead of winter, it's still amazing how much cover there is. Yeah, so that was very that was very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there was anything, just trying to grasp the fact that we were constantly surrounded by animals, whether we heard or saw them or not.
Yeah.
They were always there. We would always find trace later. I didn't find any Bigfoot tracks or anything like that, but I definitely found environments where anything like that could have happily existed without much trouble at all. So,
yeah. Now, whereabouts in Maine have you gone searching?
Most of the boots on the ground kind of trips I took were down in southern Maine in York County. And then some in here in Cumberland County, bordering on Androscoggin. And I have been up to the Skowhegan area, although it was pouring buckets that day. So we didn't really do any actual tromping around. It was mostly driving that day. And we also had a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah. Now, when you said you were on the border of Androscoggin County, were you researching the famous Durham sighting from back in the 70s?
That was part of what we were doing there. Yeah.
Yeah. Now that's really cool, not only because it's close to Lewiston, obviously, although I just want to say here at the Dirty Lou podcast, Lewiston is the heart of our podcast, but we have love for all of Maine and we reach out to the rest of Maine to find interesting stuff. But that is something that I heard of in the past, didn't know a lot about it. And come to find out, it's one of the more prominent sightings in Maine history. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would probably say without exception, it's the most famous of all of them.
Now, is that because it got the most coverage, like from the media?
I think it's had the most coverage, but it also had repeated coverage. The media would get reinterested in it on its anniversary over the years. And then Lauren posted a report with the BFRO, I think at one point. It was either with the BFRO. Oh, I think it's on the BFRO site as one of the public listings.
And the BFRO is the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, correct?
Yeah.
A really awesome website where you can research by state, right? In the whole country and even by county or cities, if I remember right, different Bigfoot stories and sightings.
Yeah. But their public listings are very different from what is in their database. What you're seeing in the public sightings is only a tiny portion of what's actually being reported to them. So just
that's
food for thought.
wouldn't it be awesome just to kind of go and meet the head of the organization and just be like, show me the coolest stuff you have. You know what I mean? Just to see the pictures and whatnot. If there's one thing I've learned from my interest in the weird is that what you see on television or what you see, for example, on television, let's say like a ghost sighting. They're like, and here we have a picture of an orb and you look at it and you're like, I mean, dust or something. You can kind of pick it apart. And what I'm trying to get at is I remember seeing a ghost show about a sighting in Maine. And I actually called the guy up after I watched his segment on a show and I asked him if I could go to his house and see, and he let me come.
Oh,
and
really?
Oh, yes. This was the mill agent's house in Vassalboro.
Yes. Yeah.
So I can tell my own, the only time I've seen what was considered a ghost, seen, was there when he let me go. And I'll say, he showed me some of the same photos with my own eyes. I saw them, the same ones that were on the show. And I was absolutely floored when I saw the photos with my own eyes. It was one of those pictures where they're like, if you look at the orb, you can see a face. And when you're watching the show, you're like, no.
Yeah.
When you see it with your own eyes, it's like, oh my, whoa, it was the most surreal and real looking thing. So, I don't totally like, negate those things, or what you see on TV is like a certain representation. So
Mhm.
I've just learned that you kind of have to see and experience things for yourself, which
Oh yeah.
kind of drives people out there to go and see those things. Now, let me circle back to the Durham Bigfoot sighting. What class of sighting was this? And could you quickly give me a little quick rundown on the Bigfoot class?
Mhm. That is definitely a Class A sighting. These are ratings that are, um, I don't know if they were originally generated by, but they are certainly uh, prominently espoused by the BFRO site. Class A is an unobstructed first person sighting. Class B is a much bigger gray area. That's, whatever it was might have been partially obscured. It might have been uh, too far away. The
Yeah.
lighting might have been really off. Any of those type of things where you don't have a clear view. And I think I'm trying to remember. I didn't do any Class C sightings for the book. So I think
Class C
Class
is
B
more
is
is
like a
more just
third,
sort of,
second person, like somebody
yes,
telling you that somebody else told them kind of
right.
thing, like a much more obscure kind of thing. But yeah, A and B sightings are what I focused on in the book.
So the Durham sighting was a Class A sighting
Mhm.
by a very young girl, if I
Mhm.
remember right.
Yeah.
Um, can you kind of just give us a really quick, brief sort of description of what happened in that sighting?
Yeah, absolutely. She and that was one of the eyewitness interviews I felt very lucky to do. She actually took me
Mm.
to the site and walked me through the whole thing herself. So
Wow.
what's written in the book is based on what she told me that day.
And this
Standing
took place in 73.
there. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. So she and her friends biked around a lot. Brunswick was really quiet back then. It wasn't as big as it is now, and so they would bike. She was telling me they would bike down the middle of the road along where they had the sighting, which terrified me because as an adult, I'm very wary of traffic. But we were standing there on the road in the middle of the road. She's like, "Yeah, we used to just sort of bike down the middle of the road all the time." So they're biking down this winding road up and down the hills. Her friend that's with her, who's about a year older than her, has her two younger brothers with her. And so they're kind of lagging behind because they're little kids. They have smaller bikes. Everything moves a lot slower. So she can hear them, but she can't see them anymore. They're probably
Mm.
about a quarter mile back on the road. And so she stops to wait for them when she gets there's like a kind of a crest in the road. And so she waited there next to this wooded area, just past the cemetery. And she's just sort of killing time, listening to them coming up behind her. And she looks into the woods and she sees a creature. It's about her height. It's covered in dark fur. It has like faintly luminescent lime green eyes. She couldn't tell if they were glowing because of reflected light but they were what she focused on.
Yeah.
Almost hypnotizing in their brightness and their intensity. And they just stared at each other. And she kind of had the feeling that this was someone else, her own, like around her age,
Like a
like
young,
young, like
a young
age, not
individual.
adult, not adult yet. Yeah. Very curious about each other. And they just stood there and stared at each other. And then her friend and her little brothers arrived. There was a shriek. Her friend fell off her bike, skinned her knee. There was a whole bunch of commotion in the middle of all this. Of course, the creature was like, okay, time to go, and just sort of pivoted and turned and took off into the woods. And that was the last she ever saw of it. So they kind of got themselves collected and headed off to her friend's house so that she could deal with, her scraped knee. And of course, when they got there, they told the parents what they had encountered. And the parents called the local law enforcement, and he came over and talked to them. And then her father came and took her home. And then all the media craziness started after that.
Now, for me, I think, if my son's 8, my daughter's 7, if they came home and told me they saw, whether I knew what a Bigfoot was or not, if they told me they saw what they described, right off the bat, I think I'd swear them off. So I think I'm like a regular dad. So for these parents to be, driven enough to call the actual police, I feel like that says a lot about the seriousness of that sighting for these kids.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the parents could tell they were really shocked and upset. And I think also at the time, the community was so small that everybody knew everybody else. And so when I say calling law enforcement, it wasn't like calling 911 here. I don't think 911 even existed yet at that point. Yeah. They called, I think, Footman, I think the local sheriff's name was.
Yes, it was Footman.
Yeah. And his office was in his house, so it was like, it's not the same experience as it would be now. So it was more like calling the responsible neighbor who's in charge of making sure weird things aren't happening, and letting them know that something really weird happened. And also the responsibility of like, no matter what it was a large animal. And so somebody should know about it in case it's going to be a problem.
Is it safe to say that it caused a little bit of hysteria in the area at the time?
If gauging from what Tamara said and how, what she observed as a kid and what shows up in the papers, yes, absolutely. And even just reading the logistics of the number of police cars that showed up, they had helicopters out there at one point, and they closed down traffic on that, or tried to keep people out of the woods on that stretch of the road because there were so many people showing up with guns to go into the woods to look for it.
Oh
so
my gosh.
Yeah, it was like the total stereotypical explosion of activity in any monster movie,
That is wild. If you don't mind, this I'm looking at your book right now, and you give a really quick, brief rundown of kind of what happened at the beginning, and then you say that Neota Huntington was driving home from a baseball game and reported seeing an ape peeking from the bushes on Durham Road in Brunswick Town Line. She coasted her car slowly so as not to scare it, but it runs into the woods. So this was a separate person.
This was the mother of Tamara's friend.
So it wasn't just the kids who claim they saw something, but it was more than that. And then at home, Neota tells her husband. He calls Deputy Sheriff Blaine Footman. Footman calls the Androscoggin Sheriff's Department, and a number of deputies were dispatched to the scene, plus game wardens and Cumberland search deputies. State police were notified. That was the real deal. It blew up quickly from the way it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are all drawn from actual newspaper articles of the time through a number of different publications. It's like the word spread very quickly.
Oh my gosh. If you don't mind, I just got to read some of the names too. Police joined the search. Over 30 police cars are dispatched from nearby towns, according to Auburn dog officer Louis Panette. I love that. I've never heard a more Lewiston Auburn name than Louis Panette, to be honest with you. Another article reported about 20 police and sheriff's deputies involved in the 2-hour search. Officers from Brunswick, Lisbon Falls, Freeport, deputy sheriffs from Cumberland and Androscoggin County. So, I mean, they rallied the troops, and everybody in the area came. Now, do you think it was more fear or curiosity that drove people at this time? This is 73 we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'm
Because
sure
if it
there
happened now, the more of a response would be all these people who are big fans of like finding Bigfoot, and like you wouldn't have people with guns showing up to these places, or would you?
Oh, I think you would. Yeah. Yeah, they're not all wanting to walk up and shake Bigfoot's hand. Some of them want to kill him. So yeah.
All right. So maybe
There's definitely a camp that is strongly in favor of taking down the first specimen they can find. Unfortunately.
Well, what do you suppose is like the drive behind that? Just to prove that it exists?
Some will say that, and others it's very clearly monetary and fame based notoriety that they're looking for.
Yeah.
So it's there. I mean, there are some who legitimately, believe that that's the only way we'll get scientific acceptance of what we've all been kind of watching happen. But there are definitely some that they do not have a higher ulterior motive. They have a fame and monetary based motivation.
Do you remember? I mean, I have the book here. I can bring it up, but what did this girl say the Bigfoot actually looked like? I believe she said it was black.
Yeah, very dark fur, which she didn't, it was under tree cover. So she didn't know if the darkness of the fur was because there wasn't like, if light had been shining on it, it might have shown up as more brown. She couldn't say for sure, but it appeared dark to her.
Well, now that since we're on the topic of what this Bigfoot looked like, in your mind, what does the average Bigfoot look like? Like when you think Bigfoot, what do you picture in your mind?
I have such a variety of images now from talking to so many eyewitnesses, and a lot of it depends on age. A lot of people think of Bigfoot in terms of the Patterson-Gimlin footage, a full-grown adult.
Yes.
And, all the people I've talked to, there have been so many different stages of growth that they've seen them at that I think the shape and the physique, the size, a lot of that really depends on how far along in its development it is. And so the one that Tammy saw was not much bigger than her. And so it was probably quite young. We can only assume. And it wasn't like a hulking giant thing. It was a slender, small, fur-covered bipedal creature. So
is this one of the smaller ones you've heard of?
It is, yeah. Probably like a young adolescent. There's a York County sighting, which is much more recent in there, which has, I think, 3 or 4, which are probably about that same age in it. There's one.
How recent was that?
Just a few years ago.
Oh, I'm surprised that went over my radar. I'm usually on those things.
Well, keep reading those eyewitness accounts. You'll find all sorts of stuff.
I will. I'm right in the meat of it right now.
Yeah.
It's just, when you hear about these sightings, like there's one sighting in this book, and I believe it was the Graff family series of encounters, which took place in the Skowhegan area. Yep. Some of the descriptions from what that family went through, like shocking. There was I believe it was maybe an uncle or a member of her family who was driving down a road, and he saw a Bigfoot sitting in a field of dandelions and just grabbing handfuls of them and shoving them in his mouth. And his wife brought him to the emergency room because she thought that he had a heart attack and was going into cardiac arrest because he was just in such a state of shock.
He couldn't speak. They really thought he was having a stroke. Yeah. And I think for pretty much everybody that I talked to, what they encountered was so shocking to them simply because it didn't fit what they knew about wildlife in Maine and, our entire existence, that just like something in your brain just like freezes and breaks because how do you fit that into your worldview? It changes everything.
I think I remember reading a term once, and it had to do with seeing, in the context that I read it in, it was a UFO. and it was called the Oz effect. Have you ever heard of it?
I think I have. You can refresh me on that though.
It's basically it's the sensation you have when you see something that your brain has such a difficulty to comprehend, where you're just like you're looking at it and it's like when the Indians in the New World saw a boat for the first time. When they looked at it, they had never seen anything like it, and it just didn't register, and they were just like shocked. So they call it the Oz effect. When people have strange sightings they can't explain, like they're almost like and their brain breaks, and they almost like it becomes almost dreamlike. So
Mhm.
that's almost what I think it's like for some people. But at the same time, the situation we're talking about with this gentleman is more just like ending up in shock.
Yeah,
And that really is a
literally.
medical emergency.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a fairly common response. A lot of the people I talked to, even if they were with another person when they had the encounter, they did not talk about it afterwards. It was just nobody talks, you just drive, you get the heck out of there. You don't talk about it again for a really long time because it's too much. It's too
Yeah.
much.
I actually, it's funny because my one experience that I've had with paranormal, and it was with ghosts, is when I went to this Vassalboro house, and a friend of mine I was with had bought a brand new digital camera, and we didn't have a plan. We're like, okay, let's go there, and the guy leaves us in part of his house, and we're taking the camera out of the box. I turn the camera on, but I don't hit record. I'm just trying to figure out how to use it. Hold it up, and it's like one of those things where you're looking at the viewfinder, and I put it on my friend, and next to my friend's head, this big bright orange ball about the size of your fist materialized. You could see it on the camera viewfinder, but when I looked at my friend, I'm like this. I'm like, Robbie, there's a flaming little orange ball next to your head. And he's just like, and I just sit there and I'm watching, and it just floats. And I keep looking at the screen and him, and I'm like, there's nothing next to him. But almost if you focus enough, you think you can see an outline of something. And then on the camera, it just went and went up in the ceiling and disappeared. We didn't talk about it again for about a week. We left that night just being like, nothing happened. What a bunch of BS, like, blah, blah, blah. And it was like a week later, I'm just like, I just get up one morning and I'm just like, oh, I saw the weirdest thing that night. And it was like super frustrating because my friend Robbie didn't see it.
Yeah.
I didn't hit record. It's my own little personal experience, but I've been using cameras a while, and this was beyond anything I'd ever seen. It was the weirdest single anomaly I'd ever seen. And we didn't talk about it for a week after. It didn't even register. It's almost like you see something happen, your mind doesn't register, and you're just like, really odd. So it's so funny you bring that up, this sensation of just being like having your brain bent in half when you see something that just is so out of this world. What is the biggest Bigfoot that you've heard described?
Probably the one that Matt Maxey saw on the old Augusta Road. That one I think sounds like the biggest. But I know the York County sighting also had adults associated with it too.
How big were they?
Um, I think they were pretty comparable to the one that Matt Maxey saw too. So, I mean, nothing. And that's the other problem too, is like, how do you gauge height?
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
I mean, you're right. I've always wondered the same thing.
you're
That's
at a
like when you hear
distance.
somebody who's like, oh, yeah, about 6 miles out. You're like, how do you know how far 6 miles is? They're like, oh, about 300 yards. And you're like, okay.
Yeah.
You,
So
you try and imagine how people know this.
Mhm. The biggest that someone has described to me and they were estimating was 8 or 9 feet. So, but most people have said 6 or 7 feet.
See, I'm 6'4". And I'm like, I'm 280 pounds. I'm a huge dude. And I think that's part of what really kind of blows my mind about the Bigfoot topic is I picture myself camping, laying in my tent, hearing a noise, getting out and just standing face to face with something that has 2 to 4 feet on me. I've even heard some people say that Bigfoot can be like 12 feet tall and like 6 feet across the chest, 800
Yes.
pounds.
The the breadth of the chest, of the frame, of the shoulders and everything is one thing that people bring up again and again. I think somebody described to me the shoulder muscle they could see on it was like the size of a watermelon. Like so they have, even if they're close to us in height, they have a breadth and a bulk that is beyond the normal human physique. And the human mind and the human psyche reacts to that very definitely. It definitely makes most of the hunters that have had these encounters know that they are no longer the alpha in that situation, and they don't like that. It's not a comfortable feeling.
It's interesting you say
and it's
that,
an
because
immediate realization of that.
yeah, they realize that even though they're armed, it may not necessarily be enough, right? I mean, like I've heard a lot of interviews where they're like, this thing, I was the most scared I've ever been in my life. My gun would have done nothing. Like, you hear them tell this story and you're just like, if that's true, that is absolutely, immense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How can something that big stay hidden for so long? And I say hidden, but plenty of people have stories of seeing them. There's lots of footage out there, pictures, video. In your opinion, how could something like a Bigfoot go fly under the radar for so long?
I think it would be a unique combination of a few elements, and that would be agility, the desire to stay hidden, and the intelligence to stay hidden.
Okay.
So black bears do a pretty good job of it generally when they want to, which is a lot of the time. But if they were a little bit smarter and a little bit more agile, and they didn't want to be seen, we would never see them, because they know the woods, they know the ways to avoid people, and it's their backyard. So and that's the other factor too, is familiarity with the terrain. Maine, I don't know how much tromping around in the woods you've done, like off of trails, but Maine has insane ridge systems all through the state, from, for various reasons, including like the glacial scraping of the state. Like even in Brunswick, there are ridges and gullies that you would never know what was on the other side of you. You wouldn't even realize there was a gully there. There are so many routes that can be taken through the terrain that eliminate any need for anybody to ever know you're there, even just 100 feet from the highway.
Wow. I mean, I guess I think sometimes we take for granted just how wild Maine is, and how realistically Portland is a city, Lewiston's a city, but they're very small cities when you think about city size. So I think a lot of people kind of take for granted that Maine is very wild, very lots of forest, right?
Yeah.
So you feel that Bigfoot are an intelligent creature?
Gauging from their reported behavior and the impression of the people who have encountered them, yeah, I would absolutely say that. Most people that I've talked to have said, that they don't give the impression of being human intelligence, but more than animal intelligence. And that could just be from differences of interest too. One of the first stories in the book, Susie, she told me that at one point she tried to teach her Bigfoot friend how to play cards.
Now, this was somebody who like, I think the term is cohabitated.
Yeah, or habituated. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And she at one point tried to show him how to play cards, and he just like wasn't interested, So there's like their priorities and interests are not ours. So it's tough to gauge exactly how smart they were. But he also knew that, when he found like a little toy truck that somebody had abandoned somewhere in the woods, he brought it to her because he knew that she liked toys, so there's definite differentiation. Like they are very, it seems like they're very aware of things that most animals are not.
Right. I remember hearing a story once where it was a guy telling his story about how he came across a Bigfoot when he was a child, and he said that they just kind of saw each other, met eyes, and the Bigfoot actually did one of these things
Ah,
and was just
yeah.
like, and then just kind of went on his way and kept walking. So he put up, the guy described it as he put up the universal sign of just like, hey, take it easy. I'm on my way. I'm out of here. Don't worry about me. Like that type of deal.
Yeah.
So for them, to have some type of intelligence, it actually seems to be pretty accurate when you think a lot of Bigfoot stories.
Mhm.
Um, why is it like we don't have a lot of actual evidence, like tangible evidence of Bigfoot?
Yeah, I mean, that's a much tougher question. Again, it could be the intelligence and stealth abilities, the agility. Um, I mean, that would be my only explanation, is they are woodsmen in their own right, and they know how to do things without leaving obvious tracks in a lot of cases. I mean, it's entirely, humans can do it, of course. So, it seems like they would be capable of that too. Um, it is baffling. It is frustrating. But you can hardly blame them.
Oh, of course.
If they're enjoying a separation between the human and Bigfoot population and they want to maintain that, of course it would behoove them to, you know, avoid places where they'll leave tracks as much as possible when they know that there's human traffic in the area. Um, yeah, that it would just be a reasonable, normal habit to maintain.
Hmm. Have you ever
But it would be the advances of DNA technology give a lot of hope, and the fact that there are some scientists that are willing to do some analysis, that is also enough to give hope that
yeah.
in spite of all their agility and adeptness at avoiding us, we might someday actually be able to find tangible proof in spite of that's an exciting prospect.
What I find very interesting about the field of Bigfoot is some of the oldest video footage we have, and you already mentioned it, was the Patterson Gimlin footage,
Mhm.
which is the famous footage that probably most of us have seen. Aren't really sure that it's actually called Patterson Gimlin, but it was filmed by two guys, Patterson and Gimlin, and it's that famous footage. I forget the name of the Bigfoot. They have a name for the Bigfoot too.
Patty.
Huh?
Patty.
Patty, yes. They have a video of Patty walking through like a gorge and just kind of walking and looking back at the camera. And it's this old, like 8mm or 4mm footage that's like grainy and beat up. And I remember like they had that footage back on In Search Of back in the day. And you're like, whoa, that's cool, but it could be a dude in a costume. Um, and what's really interesting about that is today, with the advancements in, audio and video technology, they've enhanced that footage to a degree where the evidence of that being a real creature is very solid. And I think they've really kind of proven that there's something more there than just a person in a costume. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there are a lot of people that hold that up as the best current evidence of any sort that we have.
And I think it's like some of the oldest also. I mean, in modern times, that is, since like cameras were invented. Do you remember some of like the features of Patty that made her, like these days people are just like, oh my gosh, that might be the real deal. Like I know that for me, they've managed to improve the quality so much that you can tell it's a woman.
Mhm.
That was something that always kind of blew me away. And then the way that she turns and moves, people have tried to recreate it.
Yeah,
And it really
the
just,
movement, just it has a very particular flow to it that it's baffling as to how you would fake that.
yeah. Do you have any kind of like favorite footage or, really favorite classic kind of story?
Oh, that's a good question.
I mean, for me, Patterson Gimlin, I'd say just I love that
Yeah,
because it's the
it's fascinating.
original and it's just proven to stand the test of time. And it's kind of proven to all the haters that might be
Yeah.
the real deal.
Yeah, there's a possibility. Yeah. I think my favorite is that there's somewhere out there, one of the expedition groups came up with basically a butt print, like where like a haunch and a thigh had slid in the mud at one point. And I thought that was just like, that's fascinating, and I've talked with, some of the eyewitnesses in the book about, like what would happen if we looked for the fingerprints, handprints as opposed to the footprints all the time. Like,
Yeah.
Every cow has its own nose print. Like it's like a human fingerprint. And
Oh,
like, so, it would be interesting to find a creative new way to track activity by traces like that, like something hand based as opposed to foot based. Like, but it's, maybe on a rock somewhere. Cause I mean, obviously trees are going to be iffy to collect any sort of print evidence from, but a rock, if you're in a region that has a lot of big smooth rocks in it that, they travel through, it might be interesting to check that out.
Now, what about from your own book? Like, what is one of the eyewitness stories that for you, it just has some significance? Or when you think of the eyewitness stories in your book, what comes to the forefront of your mind?
I mean, Mike Ledbury's account, just because of his pioneering spirit, I love his story because it's all about sheer willpower and determination to try to figure out what the heck is going on. And his was in Brunswick, a few years after the Durham Gorilla. So, and
So
he had
Durham, Brunswick is kind of a hot spot, or at least used to be. Maybe. All right.
Yeah.
What happened in his?
He had a number of encounters, which culminated. I don't want to ruin the story for you. You're gonna have so much fun reading it. But basically, he had a bunch of run-ins, both at night and during the day in the fields and woods near his home, because he used to roam around a lot after school when he was a teenager. And he was really fascinated and puzzled by it. And so, having watched a lot of National Geographic episodes and read a lot of the magazines at home, he was up on all the current primatology research that Diane Fossey and everybody else were exercising in order to try to get closer to primate populations. And so he decided to try a bunch of different things to see if he couldn't do something similar where he was. So that, and because I grew up reading National Geographic, my dad had a subscription. I watched all the specials on TV, like I love the idea that he actually put that to use. And wish I'm like, man, I would have loved to have done something like that when I was a kid. So I love his story. And of course there are so many short stories in the book too, where people just ran into something, crossed paths with it that just, it's hard to pick favorites. It's really hard.
I enjoy reading every story because the way you write, you have a way of really differentiating your perspective with the actual person who saw the experience. I know when it's Michelle talking, and I know when it's the witness telling their story. And the way you write, I mean, it's very descriptive and very straightforward and very easy to read, and it paints a vivid picture. So for me, reading your book and reading some of the eyewitness sightings, it's like watching a show with someone telling their really awesome sighting, and it's been a pleasure for me so far. I love it.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I felt like it was really important because of having interviewed all these people and them having given me their time and attention to do that I let them speak through their accounts and being very clear about what they were saying, what I was saying, and letting them speak and not trying to speak over them. Because I find that happens a lot in accounts that are, narrated for the general public. And I wanted to try something different that was more in line of what I thought, would be more interesting. Listen to the people that these things happen to and their experiences, because they're taking the time to tell it to us.
Did you have anybody who, you reached out to and they weren't willing to tell their story?
Oh, yeah, there were definitely a lot of missed opportunities along the way, either because they changed their mind at the last minute, or I don't even know. They just decided they didn't want to anymore. And I understand that, because it's a difficult topic to talk about. I know I had at least one eyewitness who basically said, I don't like to think about this at all. And I think it was very difficult for them to answer my questions, but they did. But I also didn't want to push it too far with them, because, I don't want to cause anybody discomfort. That's not what I'm in it for. I'm not there to exploit their discomfort. I'm there to help them put their story out there, so that maybe it will help other people who've had encounters that they can't explain, to know that they're not alone. They're not crazy. This is happening to other people too. So
well, and I think
really
it's like
important.
you said, it's not really an easy topic to discuss. And for some of these people, they actually had an experience that was rather traumatic. So
Mhm.
to try and seek some empathy from other people and not get that, in fact, get the opposite
Mhm.
of empathy, whatever that may be, where someone really can't relate and they think that you're a joke, or you're making it
Yeah.
up, or
Yeah.
you're not to be taken seriously, or you're not professional, or it reminds me of, was it the Graff family? It was a guy with the name Moody, who was this
Yep.
very well
They're dead.
respected, was he a police officer or an animal control officer?
No, he was a woodsman.
He was a woodsman.
Yeah,
And
he was
and
out
that's what
there
everyone
doing
said,
lumber
is
stuff. Yeah.
everyone basically said, they they have a hard time doubting this guy, because he would never make something up like this,
Yeah.
and he has so much credibility as a woodsman.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it seems like a lot of people who were referring to this guy kind of referred to him in a sense of like, "Ah, of course I believe him, but his story's so outrageous, it can't be
Right.
true almost."
I mean, it's that age old question. What do you do with this story? Like, there's no easy box to put it into. With the current setup that we have now, that typical list of large Maine mammals, it doesn't fit any of those. Like, how do you deal with that? Like, especially if you're, a game warden reporting to find out what's happened. Like, what do you do with that report? It's baffling. So, and reporters, you're like, how do I tell this story to the public? Because I'm sure some of them were thinking, I'm going to become a laughing stock too. So I have to do this with a little tongue in cheek, like nudge, nudge, wink, wink, like, look, this guy saw a Bigfoot, because I don't want to get made fun of too. Um, and it creates this vicious cycle of ridicule that, everybody engages in, because they don't want to be the one made fun of. So
Do you think you
it's
have a tough skin in that sense?
I don't know about that. I definitely get defensive. When somebody uh, really seems like they're pulling out all the skeptic cards in kind of a party pooper kind of way.
Yeah.
When they're just
Oh, yeah.
trying to hammer you down.
Yeah.
I much prefer people who have an open mind, who are willing to ask questions, that are skeptical, and listen to the answers and try to think around what's being presented to them for information, and really consider it and really discuss it instead of just dismissing it. Like, I mean, part of the problem with all of this is that everything gets dismissed if it doesn't fit. And, that's a huge amount of information and experiential data that just gets chucked under the rug.
Mm.
Like, it's like all we humans are only recording, a certain portion of what's being experienced by all of humanity. And this chunk that just doesn't fit the mold, oh, we don't need that. Let's just get rid of that. And it's like, it's part of the picture.
Of
Whether
course.
people like it or not, whether they know what to do with it or not, it's still part of the picture.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's, it's in the Fortean tradition. Charles Fort, who wrote books which collected information like this, like Reigns of Frogs and,
Yes.
other bizarre things like that. he collected them and put them in books because he's like, the scientists are just ignoring all this stuff. The historians are just ignoring all this stuff because they don't know what to do with it. It doesn't fit. So I'm going to collect it. I'm going to put it out there, and maybe someday we'll figure some stuff out.
Well,
And
and we almost seem to be kind of going in that direction now with the topic of UFOs. Am I right?
Yeah.
The government is sort of putting their like their imagery and their stories out there and just kind of being like, all right, we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Here's our video.
I mean, those of us who are interested in this stuff and the people who have experienced it, we just want an open discussion. It's, we don't want somebody to say, oh yes, there's little green skinned aliens everywhere around us. No, we just want to talk about what's happening in a way that doesn't squash the experiences of the people who have run into it. That's all we want.
Well, and for me, I hear people tell these stories, and like if I've heard someone tell me their personal story about something that was totally out there, it's like, my gosh, like, thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling me. And like, I can't sit there and insult someone by telling them they don't know what they're talking about when I wasn't there. I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Why would I discount what this person says?
Absolutely. And I mean, and that is a great viewpoint. And that, it indicates you have an inquiring mind. You want to know more, and to know more, you have to hear all the things that are being spoken about. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exciting.
Let me just ask, we don't have to dwell on this too much, but did you run into anybody where you were like, you rolled your eyes, where you're like, oh boy, like, was there anything where you're like, this is a little fishy?
Well, every now and then, my skeptical side kicks in, but, the longer I listen to them and the questions I ask them and their responses and stuff like that, it fills in those blanks. So I think I was really lucky that I didn't talk to anybody who I think was just there to try to manipulate me or pull the wool over my eyes. All the people I talked to seemed to have been genuinely invested in just getting their story out there. And that was it. It very easily could have gone sideways, but yeah, it's a risk when you're out there. And I feel like the Maine Bigfoot related scene barely exists. And so in that sense, it's not high profile. And so I wasn't subjected to a lot of people just kind of trying to fish for attention or anything like that. I talked to people who are for the most part, reluctant to talk, who are obviously uncomfortable about opening themselves up again after ridicule that they'd encountered in the past. And yeah, it's, I feel like I was very lucky in that respect.
Well, I mean, I agree, because I would love nothing more to speak to my neighbors and, my peers and people who live in my community about, these experiences they have. I mean, that's why I'm loving your book so much. It's just such a feast for somebody who enjoys history, folklore, somebody who enjoys, like, what do you want to call it? Like, just things about society and sociology, and it's oral history. I mean, really, there's a lot to sink your teeth into when you read your book. I love it. And I'm going to continue. I'm enjoying it. What do you kind of like say at the end of the day? Like, what do you want people to take away after they read your book?
Well, when I had finally kind of finished pulling it together and
you just released it. How long ago did you release this?
It came out at the end of May.
Okay. I knew when I heard about it, I'm pretty sure I was like, whoa, this just came out, but I didn't quite recall. It is brand new.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Excellent.
But when I was kind of tying it up last year and kind of trying to think about it in terms of like a bigger picture and summarizing it, and my one thing was, I was like, I feel like if somebody reads this book, even if they're not interested in the topic necessarily, or they definitely don't believe in it, I'd like to think if they read this book, they would still find it compelling and intriguing and kind of make them scratch their heads and say, I wonder, like I feel like that's my goal is that, if, even if you could, give a hoot about Bigfoot in Maine, if you read this book, you would still enjoy it regardless, because it turned out to be way more interesting than you thought it was going to be.
For me, I blew through about a third of it the first night I picked it up. I read, the introduction, the forward, all that stuff, and I got right up to where the sightings begin. And I mean, it's a book you can easily start and get lost in, you know.
Yeah.
And it's very vivid. Like I said, I really enjoy the writing. Um, what like w- I guess one of my final questions, if I wanted to go out in Maine and see Bigfoot, where should I
Mm,
go?
that's a good question. There's a lot of different places.
Like, let me
I
just say, like, I drive between Naples and Freiburg, like I'm going to the Freiburg Fair, and there's a part near like Keyser Falls or whatever it is where I always look around and I'm like, wow, this looks like Bigfoot territory. It's
Yeah.
marshy and like watery, lots of trees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brunswick,
I mean that
Durham.
definitely, yeah, Brunswick Durham, although they're getting built up more and more.
Yeah.
So I suspect any population there is getting pushed out slowly, as they're losing hundreds and hundreds of acres to developments
Hmm.
in recent years. I'm going to actually look in my Maine Gazetteer and find Keyser Falls, and I'm going to tell you what's in that area if there is anything.
Keyser
Because
Falls,
that,
I'm pretty sure it's Keyser Falls. It's where Stephen King like kind of has his summer home now.
well, I can tell you that there was a White Mountains encounter, um, probably just over the border around the Freiburg area, which is a little off from there, but
No, I love
um,
that area, and that's a very weird area. My family and I were there 2 weeks ago. We went to the Betty and Barney Hill sighting
oh,
on the
nice,
site. Yes, so
very
very,
cool.
very highly strange area.
Yeah, yeah. I've talked to somebody whose neighbor had a very strange experience in who's West Baldwin, which is again over towards the border. There's a lot of stuff along the Maine New Hampshire border.
Well, and there actually
That's a
seems to
pretty
be a
easy.
good amount of stuff sort of around the Lewiston Auburn area too. Like I
Yeah,
looked in your book for that. I saw the stuff that took place in the Durham site and the Brunswick sighting. There's some mention of the Androscoggin River, Livermore, Leeds, Lisbon. A lot of really
yeah,
great stuff where you look and you're like, oh my God, I know where that is.
yeah. And I mean the one that's in Hudson, his grandfather, I think it was, would talk about these people that he would run into in the woods along the Kenduskeag Egg, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was the Kenduskeag Egg, which runs down. He used to hike and fish, like go on really long trips,
Hmm.
hiking and fishing on the Kenduskeag Egg. So that area too. That I think where there are woods and water and not too many people around, and it's not too harsh a landscape because of the woods and the water. There's lots of animals. There's lots of all flora and fauna.
Was it the Aroostook Triangle?
Yep, the Aroostook Triangle, way up there. There's also stuff going on. So I honestly think almost anywhere in Maine, because I feel like there must be tons and tons of activity that either people aren't reporting or people just aren't running into because the human population in large swaths of Maine is so sparse.
Or maybe just not even realizing that they're experiencing something odd like that.
Yeah,
Because I
it's
mean, when
it's sometimes years later when they start to put things together, like the sounds they heard and the things they saw, and they're like, oh wait, this is this is more interesting than I thought it was. So
do you
yeah,
remember the Turner Triangle and the Maine Mutant?
yes, of course.
So that was Turner, which is just one of the towns kind of close over,
Mhm.
not far from Lewiston, Auburn. That was something that I really enjoyed at the time. I got just such a kick out of that. And
Yeah,
I believe Lauren Coleman has a little bit of that going on at his cryptozoology museum, right?
I believe he has the beast's paw somewhere preserved.
The
Yeah.
Beast. I love that. Michelle, I have loved talking to you, and it's just so satisfying to talk to somebody else who can have a conversation with you about this.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like
absolutely.
I talk to people who kind of have an interest, but to have somebody who has a well of knowledge about such an interesting and obscure and fringe topic, it's been a pleasure for me. And now that I've realized that you kind of have your hand in like the high strangeness of Maine. I can only imagine that if I have anything to do with the Dirty Lou podcast going forward, we're going to have more topics of paranormal, and we're going to discuss more of Maine weirdness, and probably come the holiday season, Halloween, that type of time. I would love for you to come back and we could talk some more about things that go beyond Bigfoot.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Just
And
one of my next
actually, I
books.
keep saying this, we're going to be having live podcasts in the future also. And it would be really great if we could have you come back in some capacity at that point, and I could pick your brain more about this really interesting stuff that lots of us love, whether we admit it or not.
I would love that.
Michelle, where I got your book on Amazon,
Mhm.
where can we find this? And do you have anything going on coming up that you want to let us know about?
Sure. You can actually get signed copies of the book at greenhandbookshop.com.
Oh yeah, I missed out on that. I
Um,
apologize. I'll find you one day in real life and I'll have
I'll
you sign
sign
my
your
book.
copy happily. But you can also buy it all over the place. You can buy it directly from my publisher at historypress.com, or there are a lot of Maine booksellers that have been picking it up. I believe the International Cryptozoology Museum will have signed copies very shortly as well.
I'm going to take my family to the new location. My kids have never been. My wife and I went before I had kids, and I think my kids are at the perfect age where we could go and we would really get a kick out of it.
I think you would too. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's available all over the place. And I'm trying to think if I have any other the next like Zoom events I have scheduled right now aren't until October. But I wouldn't be surprised if other things pop up in the meantime. So I usually will post all of that on the Strange Maine Facebook page and on the Strange Maine blog.
Where can we find the Strange Maine blog?
It is at strangemaine.blogspot.com.
Nice. I will definitely put that in text on this video. And yeah, I just want to thank you again for chatting. Thanks for coming on and chatting with me. It was awesome. And please keep in touch. Let us know what's going on with you. I'll be touching base periodically. And thanks again. I think this is really great, at least, for me. And I'd love to do it again in the future.
I would love to too. It's been really fun talking with you.
It was, like I said, my pleasure, totally. And this won't be the end. Thank you for coming on.